but maybe they didn't incorporate some actual development measurements. So there is socioeconomic divergence, and there is a differentiated convergence in food. So what do social movements want? Whoops, something happened here. Okay, what I'm doing here is, I mean, if you ask what is to be done, you know, who am I to say? I'm just taking some of the main demands from social movements in Mexico, and they would like to restore food sovereignty, which, by the way, if you remember that spike in food production at the turn of the 1970s, 1980s, Mexico actually had a concerted policy of food sovereignty at the time, partly because Mexico had just discovered these large oil reservoirs on the basis of which the Mexican government got fairly indebted. That eventually led to Mexico's first major crisis of indebtedness that set off the 1980s as the lost decade of Latin America. But at that time, that food sovereignty, the food sovereignty program created, supported peasants, and people didn't have to migrate in order to make ends meet, and so on and so forth. And so that allowed for reconstructing, or might allow for reconstructing the countryside and to preserve biodiversity. Biodiversity happens to be a particularly strong concern in Mexico because, as you might know, corn originated biologically in Mexico. So Mexico has the main biodiversity in corn. And we are in this paradoxical situation in which if Mexico accepts GMOs or transgenic corn, it will threaten the very raw material that has allowed plant breeders to introduce strength into new varieties of corn. So, by adopting the new varieties, you're also eliminating the raw material for plant breeding. So that's one of the main paradoxes of modern agriculture in general. So, and these are, explicit concerns from a number of social movements in Mexico. And finally, I just want to show you the cover for my book that's coming out in Mexico. And I'll welcome any questions. Yes, well, the latest that has happened with regard to corn is that a judge put a moratorium on its deployment. I mean, the legislative apparatus had approved the deployment of corn, but there was a lot of unrest in some of these social movements, and to the point that a judge managed to do that. So the struggle is still on. I mean, Monsanto is extremely interested in introducing it. In fact, they call the law that enabled this deployment the Monsanto law. The same is happening in Guatemala. Exactly the same thing, because it's been a judge in Guatemala that, after a lot of wrangling and a lot of success on the part of social movements, from legislating the possibility of introducing transgenic corn, it passed, the law passed, but eventually a judge, also stopped it, just a couple of weeks ago. Okay?
Some of
We're what? Oh, forcing lower incomes.
So people could reflect lower income. So basically, the higher unemployment that we have in the Great Recession, people might spend a slightly higher percentage of their income on food. It wouldn't necessarily mean a change in diet as much as a stable diet with the income structure. Because it's going to be, as opposed to the 1984 that 2008.
Yeah, I mean, it is a possibility, but I guess, I mean, we also have the inflation data, right? And so, I mean, I think the inflation data confirmed that it does take more income, a larger share of income, from perhaps a diminished budget, which would be even worse. But it does take a larger share of the budget to purchase, what people consider, minimum food intake. Yeah, so that may be a complicating or an exacerbating circumstance. Yeah. Yes.
Soya, between 1960 and 2010, how much has production increased?
A lot.
Yeah.
Soybeans, yeah. You mean in Mexico?
Take what you want.
Yeah, Mexico imports about 95% of its soybeans, so mostly from the States.
So the production has increased sort of 10 times, 100 times in Americas?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, yeah.
And the observation I made back in the 1960s when I lived in Central America, in Costa Rica, they had a dish, gallo pinto, which had nothing to do with chicken. It was a mixture of black beans and rice. In El Salvador, we didn't have that. We had black beans here and rice there. Decades later, when I came back to El Salvador, I was surprised to see you wouldn't get black beans. Like gallo pinto now or something. How is that? And then what you say, the import into China, right?
Oh,
Without China, the soybean production would have jumped the way it has, right?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I know that soybeans intake in China has increased, but I don't think that it comes primarily from imports from Brazil. I think most of the exports from Brazil go to Europe. So, but I mean, I'd have to explore that data. Yeah.
Europe 50 years ago was soybean.
Right.
I remember that.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. Yes.
There is a documentary, I think the title is On the Other Side, and it talks about the evolution of prices of corn in Mexico after NAFTA. The corn coming from the United States was much cheaper than the corn produced in Mexico, which led to abandoning native corn production in Mexico. Is that what comes out from your research as well? That's your vision of what happened?
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, so in very simple terms, you might say that the main producers of grain in Mexico were small peasant producers. The main producers of fruits and vegetables were commercial, capitalized farmers. And so these were the ones that benefited, whereas small peasant producers were bankrupted. Many of them had to migrate. And I mean, that's why, I mentioned, without elaborating, the issue of migration. I have an article actually published in 2011 on NAFTA, globalization, and migration, where I claim that Mexico has lost both its food sovereignty and its labor sovereignty. Defining labor sovereignty is the ability of a nation state to absorb the majority of its labor force with living wages. Mexico lost that sovereignty. Yes.
So I have a question that has happened, and
I mean, I think the whole dynamic is led by the transnationals or the multinationals, because I mean they're the ones that lobby the politicians to get the kind of legislation that they need. So
they're the same, they're basically two sides of the same dynamic.
yeah, I mean one interesting point about these beer being basic and wine being luxury. It also happens that beer happens to be one of the most concentrated sectors in the world. I mean, there's just a handful of companies that control most of the beer production in the world, whereas wine is completely diversified, right? I mean, there's just in British Columbia, there are about 120 wineries, and they produce some good wine too. Argentine wine is better value. Alberto?
Yeah, just follow up on what Catherine was asking. So in terms of area of corn grown in Mexico, the area has actually increased?
Shrunk.
Or maybe,
Okay, that's an interesting question because what's happened is very surprising in a way. And here it's too bad that Gay left because what's happened is that there's been a tremendous corporatization of corn producers in the sense that most corn used to be produced in central and southern Mexico. Now more than a quarter of the corn is being produced in Sinaloa by highly capitalized farmers. And there's also a couple of companies that control, like Gruma, they produce maseca. And a lot of tortillerias actually produce the tortillas using the maseca flour, corn flour. So, I mean, there's been an incredible oligopolization of corn trade and also of corn production. So, but I don't think the area has declined that much. I mean, there's been a shift in terms of who are the main producers. But there's been a tremendous increase in demand as well because of to feed the chickens. I'm not sure how much yellow corn is produced in Mexico, though. Yes?
does the corn seed mainly come from big companies, or is it still the local farm?
Seed. It's mostly the big companies. The Mexican government used to have PRONACE, Productora Nacional de Semillas, but that was one of the things that was disbanded with the neoliberal governments in the 1980s with Carlos Salinas de Gortari. Huh? Oh yeah, completely. Any other questions, comments, criticisms, suggestions for enhancing the analysis? Yeah.
I have three questions, and you kind of, some of them maybe just some suggestions to think about as
Mhm.
well. So I'm curious how what you've been talking about, the impact that it's had or may have in the future on health services in Mexico.
Health services, yeah.
Right, so the caloric intake, energy deficit, obesity. I'm also curious from a consumption level, how the social movements or how your research thinks about food cultures and how people are very attached to certain foods over others, and how social movements and you as at least someone who's presenting those conclusions as part of your research thinks about shaping food cultures in terms of going from the macro data to how people think about the food that they love, like Coca-Cola.
Mhm.
And then the third thing that I was curious about is whether you can speculate as to why the U.S. would want to become, why they would want to put a focus, in the late 80s and early 90s on creating a neoliberal food regime or extending their food regime where other industries in the United States are obviously losing in this kind of global trade battle, right? Why is it that the food regime is the thing that the U.S. is kind of continuing to use as its tool and not the steel regime?
The steel?
Well, other industries.
Right.
Other industries
Automobile,
the U.S. has
yeah.
dominated for a while, or the oil industry.
Okay.
Did you consider that and talk about that?
Yeah, well, I don't know that much about the health industry, but I can tell you that 10% of Mexicans now have diabetes. And this is, you know, a tremendous spike. And I think it's directly related to these tremendous, well, to the sugar industry and to the soft drinks. So, I mean, it's a big challenge. And unfortunately, the government is taking the completely wrong approach by taxing soft drinks. I mean, what you're doing, first of all, you assume that the individual is the responsible one, when it's the whole structure of food production that is pushing people into this kind of diet. And so you're penalizing the poorest, you know, by taxing the wrong kind of food. Anyway, there's a whole discussion about, you know, how to do these things. On the food culture, I think, I mean, that's a major question as to, you know, one of the things that has inspired the movements is, for instance, one of the slogans was, sin maíz no hay país. You know, without corn, there's no country. Y sin frijoles tampoco, no? Yeah, so you need your beans. I mean, Mexico also has an incredible diversity in beans. So I think there's a lot of concern on the part of ecological movements and peasant movements on these things. But on the other hand, I was shocked just in January to be in Mexico City and find that most of the tacos I had, you know, in restaurants, on the street, the tortillas were yellow because they're now using yellow corn, which is transgenic, almost by definition. You know, like 95% of the corn in the States is transgenic. Now they're using it. And in the north, in Monterrey, Torreón, which is my hometown, they're still using the white stuff, you know, the white corn. So I think that was major for me.
Are you suggesting all those people in Mexico City become peasants?
No. I mean, what I'm saying is that a lot of tortilla producers in Mexico City are using the cheaper yellow corn to produce it. Because, I mean, white corn is more expensive than yellow corn. And people are just eating them. I mean, I didn't see any complaints. So I think there's going to be a major shift in food culture. And the last question was?
Why the U.S.
Oh, yeah.
It's by choice, right?
Right.
If there are cartels that are choosing to do these things, why would they choose to stake their kind of 21st century claim
Yeah.
on colonialism on food regime,
Yeah.
not oil?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I guess the answer there is another question: who rules food politics in the States? And I would say that right now, in regard to corn, for instance, there's a tremendous infight within the capitalist class, because you have the ethanol producers who want, you know, lower corn prices because corn is a raw material for them. The livestock or feedlots, they also want lower prices. So, corn, high fructose corn syrup, they also want lower prices. But then there's finance capital, you know, investing in futures. They want higher prices. So these are completely contradictory forces within, you know, the lobby groups. And I mean, it all depends on which lobby group is more deep-pocketed, and that will be a good predictor of which way your Congress people will go in defining, you know, the food bill or agriculture bills or farm bills. That's what they're called.
The corn may be more powerful than
Well, than oil? I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, there are huge subsidies both for oil and for corn. So, I mean, those are, you know, some of the strongest lobbies in this country. Yeah.
Thank you, Gerardo. He'll be here the whole semester.
Thank you.